Hello, and welcome to KRAD COVID readings, doing my bit to cure the coronavirus blues. Back in 1995, which was 25 years ago now, Esther M. Friesner started the Chicks in Chainmail anthology series. Chicks in Chainmail was published in 1995. It was a huge hit. It was an anthology published by Baen Books of humorous stories featuring female protagonists who were mostly wearing armor. It was at the height of Xena Warrior Princess's popularity, and it's won several sequels, the most recent of which came out in 2015 on the occasion of the first anthology's 20th anniversary. I contributed to one of them, Did You Say Chicks, which was the second of the several anthologies in the Chicks in Chainmail milieu, as it were. And I wrote it in collaboration with Marina Frants, to whom I was married at the time. It's a story that involves Russian folklore. Marina's Russian. And she actually wrote a follow-up to it in the third anthology, which is called Chicks in Chained Mails, which she wrote by herself. This one, I worked with her on it mainly because Marina was struggling with the humor aspect of the story. And she basically said to me, help me write this and make it funny. So this resulted in my only fiction collaboration with Marina. We collaborated on a couple of articles together as well, and we split up in 2000 completely amicably. We're still friends. She's out in California now. She got her PhD in oceanography, and she's working out there. And this is the only short story we wrote together professionally, which was called A Bone to Pick. We actually collaborated on a couple other things too. We wrote a Quantum Leap novel proposal, which we then sent off to Ace Books, which was not taken, unfortunately. But we would have done that one together, too. Anyway, A Bone to Pick by Marina Frants and Keith R.A. DeCandido. They're having another council, Marina whispered, leaning over the fence into Vasilisa's garden. Neither the whispering nor the leaning was necessary. Besides Vasilisa, the only living creatures within earshot were the half-dozen chickens milling aimlessly outside their coop, and Vasilisa's cat asleep in a sunny spot on the windowsill. But Matrena liked nothing more than telling a secret, so when no secret was available, she made do by delivering ordinary pronouncements in a conspiratorial whisper. They've been in there since sunrise. Vasilisa looked up at the sky. It was almost noon. When they say we talk a lot, what are they waiting for? A message from heaven? She scooped a handful of seed from her apron pocket and tossed it to the chickens, who immediately began fighting over it. The townsmen had spent most of the week trying to decide what to do about the Tatars, who had sacked 5 nearby villages in the past month, and who were now rumored to be less than 3 days south of Voronezh. The town elders had sent messengers to Kiev, asking for soldiers to protect them. The messengers came back with notes saying that the request from the noble township of Voronezh is being taken under advisement by the Tsar. Whoever did the Tsar's advising must not have considered Voronezh all that noble, though, since no soldiers were forthcoming. So the men held councils, the women whispered across fences, and no one actually did anything. It's a hard thing to decide, Matrena began, but Vasilisa interrupted. There's nothing hard about it. The soldiers aren't coming. We have to protect ourselves. We can leave. The Tatars are nomads. They're used to traveling all the time. Most of us have never even left the town. When we stumble around trying to get our horses to do something other than pull a plow, the Tatars will catch up and pillage us on the road instead of here. Heaven forbid. Matrena made a quick warning sign. Must you always believe the worst, Vaska? Vasilisa winced. She hated being called Vaska, but she had long ago given up complaining about it. Besides, Matrena wouldn't let her get a word in as she barreled onward. That's what comes of living all alone for so long, with only chickens for company. You need a husband, a few little ones to cheer you up. You know my sister's boy, Danilo, is looking for a wife. Vasilisa suppressed a sigh. Only Matrena would think of matchmaking with the Tatars knocking at the door. When they come, she'll probably ask them to marry her nieces, she thought. Matrena seemed to be waiting for a response, so Vasilisa said, I'm sure Danilo can find someone more suitable than me. Matrena was not to be dissuaded. He's not looking for a beauty, you know. Vasilisa bit her tongue. You cook well and keep a clean house. That makes up for a lot. Even for freckles and hair the color of carrots? Just what I've always wanted, to be courted for my borscht recipe. Vasilisa searched for a politely neutral response, but before she could think of one, the subject of the conversation came walking up the path towards Matrina's yard. "Danilo!" Matrina ran to the gate and let him in. "Is the council over? Have they decided what we're going to do?" "Yes, Auntie." Danilo kissed Matrina on the cheek and gave Vasilisa a polite nod. "We will leave tomorrow morning and head for Kiev. If the Tsar won't send soldiers to protect us, he can shelter us instead." "Tomorrow morning?" Vasilisa shrieked in a voice that sent the chickens scurrying back to their coop. "How far do you think we'll get with less than 2 days' start? The Tatars will ride us down before we're halfway there." "Well, they'll kill us for sure if we stay here," Danilo said irritably. "What else can we do?" "We can stay and fight," Vasilisa snapped. "If the Tsar won't help, we must ask elsewhere." "Elsewhere?" Danilo repeated incredulously. "If not the Tsar, then where? Do you propose to climb up to the sky and ask the sun for help?" "No, I propose to go into the forest and ask Baba Yaga." She knew as soon as she spoke that she made a mistake. Matrina and Danilo gaped at her. Then they both fell back a step and made signs against the evil eye. "Don't even joke about such things," Matrina gasped. "She's a witch, Vasilisa." "I know she's a witch. That's why she can help. If we can find her..." "Enough," Danilo interrupted. "This is hard for all of us, Vasilisa. I know you're frightened and saying things you don't really mean, so I'll forget all this talk of seeking help from witches, and so will Matrina. Now, you go start gathering your things and stop talking nonsense." He folded his arms across his chest and jutted his chin at Vasilisa. It wasn't much of a chin, but Vasilisa pretended to be impressed. "I'm sorry, Danilo. You're right. It was only my fear talking. I will see you later." And then she fled into the house before she could say anything else to shock the neighbors. "Stop talking nonsense," he says. Vasilisa paced the length of her house, muttering to herself and kicking the furniture. "They're planning to try to outwalk a Tatar horde, and he tells me to stop talking nonsense." She kicked the wall this time. The shelves rattled. She had already overturned one chair and sent a jug full of cream crashing to the floor, much to the delight of the cat. Vasilisa considered cleaning it up, then decided not to bother. The whole house would be ashes in 3 days' time anyway, unless someone did something. Unless you do something. The thought kept popping up again and again over the past hour. Vasilisa stopped her pacing and looked around her home. It didn't take long. She just had the one room, dimly lit by early afternoon sunlight filtering in through the 2 windows. There wasn't much furniture, and the only spot of color was a woven rug patterned with white and yellow roses that Vasilisa made the year before. Not exactly the Tsar's palace in Kiev, but it was hers, and she had no wish to lose it. Vasilisa made up her mind all at once. She would go into the forest and look for Baba Yaga. Let Matrina and Danilo quake in their shoes and make warning signs. As far as Vasilisa was concerned, a choice between witchcraft and dying was no choice at all. There was no point in lengthy preparations. She planned to be back by the next morning, or not at all. Vasilisa put out extra food for both the chickens and the cat, and wrapped up half a loaf of bread to take with her. The other half she put on a saucer together with a small bowl of salt, and placed the saucer by the oven in the hopes that it would bribe the domovoi to guard the house from mishap while she was gone. A pair of sturdy shoes, a red shawl to keep her shoulders warm, and she was ready to go. She didn't see a soul on her way out of town. Presumably everyone was at home, packing up their possessions for the journey. Just as well, Vasilisa thought. Given the mood she was in, if someone asked where she was going, she would probably tell them. She had a bad moment when she walked past the church, imagining Father Piotr's reaction to her plan. But the church doors were shut, and the priest was nowhere in sight. Vasilisa breathed a deep sigh of relief, and sped up her steps. 3 hours later, she was beginning to wish that Father Piotr had been there to stop her. She'd never gone this far into the forest before. It was much larger and darker than she expected. There were no paths, no clearings, no sign of human life at all. The trees grew so close together that their roots intertwined. It seemed to Vasilisa that she had tripped over every single one of those roots in the course of one afternoon's walk. All she had to show for her grand quest were a torn dress, scraped knees, aching feet, and twigs festooned about her hair. "The devil take this forest and every tree in it!" she muttered as she picked herself up off the ground for the 1000th time. Was it her imagination, or did that last withered root actually move to snag her ankle as she tried to step over it? How hard can it be to find a hut that walks on giant chicken legs? You'd think that a witch that likes to eat human flesh would make herself easier to find when human flesh actually comes looking for her. She brushed the dirt off her skirt and resumed walking. 10 paces later, she was flat on the ground again. This time she knew the bare, dead-looking oak tree in her path had tripped her on purpose. She actually saw the root moving before she fell. Vasilisa sat up, rubbed her elbow where she bruised it in the fall, and tried to think. She was not going to get anywhere if she had to fight the forest every step of the way. Already shadows grew long. It would be dark soon. Vasilisa didn't relish the thought of spending the night outside, but she was not turning back. If nothing else, she wasn't sure she'd find the way. She hadn't expected to be out this long, and the bits of string she'd left to mark her path would be invisible in the dark. Baba Yaga was her only chance, not only of saving the town, but of ever seeing the wretched place again. "Not leaving," she announced to the forest at large. "Do you hear me, Yaga? I'm not leaving. You might as well show yourself, because I'm staying in this forest until I either find you or drop dead." Her only answer was the rustle of leaves, and the call of wild geese somewhere in the distance. Vasilisa abruptly realized how foolish she must sound, sitting there covered in dirt and twigs, yelling at the trees. She stifled a laugh and climbed to her feet again, resolved to keep walking until dark. As soon as she stood up, she saw something that she could swear hadn't been there before her last fall. A narrow path weaving through the trees. Vasilisa stared at it suspiciously. Had she missed it before, or had it just appeared? Was it an invitation from Yaga, or a trick? Would it lead her in circles until she was hopelessly lost? It didn't matter, she decided. The only way to be sure was to go ahead. Vasilisa straightened her shoulders and tried to look brave as she stepped onto the path. The route it led her on was so twisted and roundabout that she almost concluded that it was a trick. But no root tripped her as she walked. No dead branch tore at her clothes or snagged her hair. And while the wood grew darker and darker around her, the path was lit as clearly as if it were midday. Vasilisa tried to take comfort in these things and pressed on. The path came to an end at a place that was lit as bright as the candles in Father Piotr's church. But the light did not flicker, not even when a light breeze rustled the branches and blew a twig out of Vasilisa's hair. Vasilisa hiked up her skirt and ran toward the light. The trees parted before her, and she stumbled out into a large clearing. The light was so bright now it dazzled her for a moment, and she stood blinking away tears until she could see again. In front of her was a waist-high picket fence made entirely of bones. White, gleaming bones, neatly held together with twine. Vasilisa gave a little scream, quickly stifled as she realized the bones were much too large to be human. She couldn't imagine what they might be. Even bears didn't grow this large. The gate was made of smaller bones tied to form a grid. Bird skulls the size of large cabbages were set at even intervals all along the fence. The light came from their eyes. Past the fence, just as the story is told, stood a hut on chicken legs. The legs were taller than Vasilisa, yellow and wrinkled, with the claws buried deep in the ground for anchorage. Behind them, she could make out what looked like a vegetable garden and a small chicken coop. But for its support, the hut itself looked perfectly ordinary with its wooden walls, thatched roof, and two small windows, with brightly painted yellow shutters. Vasilisa wondered how Baba Yaga got in and out with her front door 6 feet above the ground. Did she fly? How was Vasilisa going to get up there? "Hello?" she called out. "Is anybody home?" "I am. I know who you are." The door flew open with a bang. A wooden ladder slid out and hit the ground with a thud. A pair of skinny legs appeared, clad in sagging woolen stockings and shod in woven bast slippers. The legs found purchase on the ladder, and a moment later the rest of Baba Yaga came into view. She was obviously ancient, but she clambered down the ladder with no apparent difficulty. Having reached the bottom, she clapped her hands twice, and the ladder scooted back into the house by itself. Yaga turned, placed her hand on her hips, and glared at Vasilisa across the yard. "There," she announced. "I've shown myself. Are you happy now?" She clutched a wooden spoon in one hand and wore a stained white apron over her dress. Vasilisa wondered what she might be cooking, then decided she didn't really want to know. Vasilisa made a respectful bow. "I am sorry to disturb you, grandmother, but this is important. I need to talk to you." Yaga sneered, baring uneven yellow teeth. "Talk to me? Aren't you afraid I'll put the evil eye on you? Make you ugly? Make your cow's milk go dry?" "No, I'm afraid you'll decide that my bones are just the thing to mend that gap on the other side of the fence." Vasilisa's mouth felt dry. She told herself that if Yaga wanted to eat her, she would have tried to lure her inside, not scare her away, but the thought didn't provide much comfort. Well, if she couldn't feel brave, at least she could act it. "I'm already ugly, and I haven't got a cow. May I come into the yard? I hate talking over a fence. It makes me feel like I'm gossiping." Too bad. Yaga shook her spoon at Vasilisa. You think I let just anybody into my yard? You tell me what you want, and I'll think about it. Very well. Vasilisa moved to lean on the fence, then remembered what it was made of and hastily straightened up again. I want you to help me save Voronye from the Tatars. You're a witch. There must be something you can do. Must there? I doubt the Tatars will come into the forest to bother me. And what do I care for Voronye? There's nothing there except mud and stink and stupid people who blame me every time a cup breaks or a pot overboils. If I went into your marketplace, people would spit and throw turnips at me. If I went into your church, the priest would drive me out. Why should I help you? Vasilisa wanted to point out that she would not spit and throw turnips, but she doubted it would make much difference to Yaga. She tried frantically to think of something that would make a difference, but she was too tired to match wits with Baba Yaga the way heroines and stories did. All she could think of was how much she wanted to sit down and take her shoes off. I don't know, she admitted, but there must be something you want. Something that would convince you. Tell me what it is and you can have it. In truth, she couldn't imagine anything she might have that a witch would want, but there had to be something. There just had to be. Baba Yaga stared at Vasilisa with an amazed expression. After a few moments, her eyes squeezed tightly shut and her head shook. She made a noise like a creaky hinge. It took Vasilisa a moment to realize she was laughing. Anything I want, Yaga wheezed between laughs. What a generous town! And what if I want a mountain of gold, or the palace in Kiev, or the moon? Vasilisa sighed. Then Voronye will die, and you'll get nothing. I don't believe you want the moon. Tell me your price, and I'll meet it if I can. Yaga stopped laughing, but a grin still crinkled her face. You, or the town? Me. No one in Voronye knows I'm here. They didn't want to ask you. So whatever bargain you make, it will be with me only. Yaga stepped closer to peer into Vasilisa's face. Up close she smelled of mushrooms and herbs and freshly cut onions. Vasilisa had expected the whiff of human flesh, though of course she had no idea what cooked human flesh smelled like. Maybe it smells like the mushrooms, she mused, then quickly pushed the thought away. Baba Yaga tapped her spoon against the fence absent-mindedly. The wood made a little clicking noise against the bone. You're a brave girl, she finally said, but not very smart. Vasilisa was stunned. It's not what they say in Voronye. Oh, really? And what do they say? They say I'm a smart girl, but not very pretty. Do they? Baba Yaga gave another creaky laugh. Well, they may be right. After all, they've known you longer. Why don't you come in so I can get to know you two? She gestured with the spoon, and the gate swung open of its own accord. Vasilisa pretended not to be impressed as she walked through, but once inside the yard, she could no longer restrain her curiosity. What kind of bones are those? She pointed at the fence. I've never seen any that big. Yaga patted the fence fondly as if it were alive. Chicken bones. Vasilisa didn't know whether to laugh or be scared. Chickens? They must grow taller than the trees. What do you feed them, and where can I get some of it? Yaga looked highly pleased with herself. The chickens are ordinary size. It's the bones that are large. I don't understand. Of course you don't. They walked into the back garden, stepping carefully between the neat rows of turnips and cabbages. When they reached the chicken coop, Baba Yaga took some seed from her apron pocket and scattered it on the ground. The chickens promptly scurried out, clucking self-importantly at each other, and began pecking at their dinner. See? Yaga said. Ordinary chickens. And as long as they live, I can't make them anything else. It's only the dead things that do my bidding. She bent down and plucked a weed that had insinuated itself among the carrots. This is dead, she said, but it hasn't realized it yet. I'll tell it now. She held the weed close to her face and murmured at it in a voice so soft, Vasilisa couldn't make out a single word. As she spoke, the weed began to shudder and writhe in her hand. The leaves curled and the stalk shriveled. Its color changed from green to yellow to brown. By the time Yaga finished speaking, only a withered husk was left. She breathed on it, and it crumpled to dust and blew away. I can help you, Yaga said, but there will be a price. Name it. Oh, no, it's not for me to name. I will give you a spell to drive away the Tatars. Go home, use it, and wait. When you know what the price is, come back here. How will I know? You'll know. Baba Yaga grabbed Vasilisa's arm and bustled her back toward the hut. Come along now. The spell will take most of the night. We must prepare. We? Vasilisa squeaked. I don't know how to prepare any spells. Yaga only laughed again. The sun was just rising over the treetops when Vasilisa staggered into Voronezh, dusty and disheveled, and lugging an extremely heavy and awkwardly shaped sack over one shoulder. She found most of the town's population gathered in the marketplace. Those who owned horses had harnessed them to carts loaded with all their worldly possessions. Those who didn't carried bundles stuffed with as much as they could lift without toppling over. Vasilisa quickly spotted Matrena. Her cart was larger than anyone else's and piled twice as high. "Vaska! Here you are! I've been looking for you all morning!" She poked Vasilisa's sack, which rattled in response. "You won't get very far carrying that. My cart is too full, but I'm sure Danilo will find a spot on his if you ask him nicely." Vasilisa was too tired to deal politely with Matrena's matchmaking. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "And don't call me Vaska. I hate that." She dropped the sack into the dirt with a groan of relief, untied the twine that held it shut, and turned it upside down. A pile of white bones came spilling out into the dirt, followed by a grinning human skull that bounced twice before landing with a thud at Matrena's feet. Matrena shrieked. Some of the people standing within earshot turned, saw the bones, and also shrieked. The noise spread like ripples through a lake until Father Piotr elbowed his way through the crowd to see what the commotion was about. He did not shriek at the sight of the bones, but he placed his hands on his hips and glared at Vasilisa. "Where did these come from?" he demanded. "I should think that would be obvious," Vasilisa said. Father Piotr simply glowered in response. Once that glower would have sent Vasilisa meekly to her knees in apology, but after spending an evening with Baba Yaga, she was not so easily intimidated. Still, she supposed she'd have to tell them sooner or later. "Baba Yaga gave them to me," she said. There was a collective gasp, and everyone except Father Piotr fell back a step. The priest stood his ground, though he did cross himself somewhat more emphatically than usual. "Are you insane?" he hissed. "Don't you think we have enough trouble without you bringing unclean magic among us? You'll bring bad luck to the journey. We'll be lost." "We don't have to go anywhere," Vasilisa interrupted. "Yaga's put a spell on these bones to drive away the Tatars. We'll be safe now." "Safe?" Father Piotr's voice rose so much that he started to sound like Matrena. It was all Vasilisa could do to keep from snickering. "And who will keep us safe from Yaga when she comes to demand her price? When she wants our blood for her potions or our bones for her next spell?" "She won't. I came to her alone, so I pay alone." She swore on it. "And you believed her?" Father Piotr grabbed Vasilisa by the shoulders and gave her a vigorous shake. "What's wrong with you, girl? Are you bewitched or just stupid? An oath means nothing to a witch. They're coming!" someone screamed. Vasilisa turned and saw a rising cloud of dust in the distance on the other side of the wheat fields. "That's impossible." Father Piotr let go of Vasilisa's shoulders and took a shaky step back. They weren't supposed to get here for another 2 days." Vasilisa rolled her eyes. "Why don't you go tell them that? I'm sure if you explain politely that they are ahead of schedule, they'll go away and come back on Sunday." No one responded to this. People were too busy grabbing their bundles and running, or jumping on their carts and riding, or rushing about in circles and screaming that they were going to die. Vasilisa put her hands over her ears to help shut out the noise, stood over the bone pile, and recited the spell Yaga had taught her the night before. As she spoke the last word, the bones began to move. At first they crawled along the ground, spreading themselves in a circle around Vasilisa's feet. Then they floated into the air, spinning as they rose. A few seconds later, Vasilisa stood at the center of a rattling whirlwind of bones. The ground beneath her feet trembled slightly. She couldn't tell if it was a side effect of the spell or just a sign of the Tatar army approaching at full gallop. All she could see was a blurred wall of white and dust. The carts, the ground, and the marketplace stalls were all covered with generous portions of dust, and the bones kicked up all of it. Vasilisa sneezed. Maybe I should have done this in a cleaner place. Like the church. Father Piotr would love that. Something detached itself from the whirlwind. It looked like several human rib cages fused together into a solid mass. It struck Vasilisa's chest and stayed there, forming a breastplate. Other bones, equally misshapen or restructured, attached themselves to her sides, her shoulders, her back. She barely had time to gather her skirt up around her hips before the bones surrounded her legs. She lifted her arms, and the bony sleeves encased them. As a finishing touch, the skull grew as big as a bucket and landed on her head with one final clunk. The whirlwind ceased. In its place was an armor made of bones. A heavy, stuffy, and extremely uncomfortable armor, with some of the dust still trapped inside it. Vasilisa sneezed again, banging her head against the back of the helmet, and looked around. She couldn't see very well through the eye holes, but it seemed to her that half the town's population had fled the square. The rest were watching her from a distance, muttering softly among themselves. Father Piotr was still there, clutching the crucifix around his neck and praying under his breath. "It's all right," Vasilisa told them. Her voice echoed hollowly inside the skull helmet. The ground was shaking harder now. The riders must be getting closer. Unfortunately, she could not turn her head inside the helmet to look at them. So what do I do now? She wondered. Then the armor began to walk. Vasilisa yelped and flailed her arms, or rather, she tried to flail them, but could only rattle them about inside the sleeves. The armor moved with a will of its own, and all Vasilisa could do was ride along. It turned to the right, and then walked her out onto the middle of the field and stopped. Now she could see the approaching riders, the small, dirt-spattered horses and the wiry, leather-clad men. There weren't as many of them as Vasilisa expected, but there were certainly more than enough to trample Veronia to the ground. They came closer and closer, but once again the armor would not move. Sweat poured down Vasilisa's face. She started to panic. The entire army was going to ride right over her without breaking stride while she stood there trapped in a pile of bones. Why did it form around me if I can't control it? What kind of magic is this anyhow? Then the first line of horses came to a dead stop. Vasilisa could hear shouting and clanging and stomping hooves as the riders back in the back tried to avoid collision. Some failed and the horses went down screaming, taking their riders with them. Vasilisa mentally braced herself. Surely the armor will move now. It didn't. You now want to let me move it. She tried to take a step forward and succeeded only in banging her knee. And maybe not. The Tatars regrouped much faster than Vasilisa expected, but nothing they could do would make their horses move any closer. Finally, Vasilisa realized what was happening. The armor didn't need to move as long as the riders stayed mounted. The horses knew death magic when they smelled it, even if their riders didn't. They trembled, they whinnied, they pawed the ground, but they wouldn't move an inch. One of the riders fired an arrow, which struck the armor in the chest. Vasilisa felt no impact, but heard the crack of the broken wood as the arrow snapped in two and fell to the ground. More arrows came with similar results. The armor, apparently realizing it now had to deal with humans, chose this moment to take a step forward and raise its arms, which almost yanked Vasilisa's arms out of their sockets. The armor clawed at the air like a hungry bear. Deciding to participate in the only way left to her, Vasilisa shouted, "Boo!" It came out like something like the howl. It came out sounding like the howl of a demon. That finally did it. The horses broke and ran, and the riders made only a token effort to stop them. Within minutes, only a trampled wheat field remained to show that an army had ever come anywhere near Veronia. When the Tatars were out of sight, the bone armor fell from around Vasilisa, hit the ground with a dull thud, and then crumpled to dust. It wasn't until the next morning that Vasilisa realized that something was wrong. The previous day was filled with activity as the people of Veronia returned to their homes, unpacked their belongings, and gathered in the backyards to gossip about what had happened. Vasilisa herself had been too tired to do anything more than stagger to her own house, collapse on the bed, and sleep. But by early next morning, as she went out to feed the chicken, she called her usual greeting to Matrena, and Matrena crossed herself and backed away. It got worse from there. She went to the market, and the women spat and threw turnips at her. She tried to go to church, and Father Piotr wouldn't let her in. Children pointed at her and screamed "witch" until their mothers dragged them away. After 2 days of this harassment, Vasilisa realized that she could not live like this. Leaving aside any other considerations, she really hated turnips. Well, she thought, at least now I know what price to name to Baba Yaga. On her second trip into the forest, this time carrying her few belongings and her cat, Vasilisa spotted the path immediately. The forest seemed less tangled, less dark, almost welcoming. Baba Yaga waited for her outside the hut, looking much the same as she had before, except her apron was cleaner. She still smelled of mushrooms and onions, as well as a spice Vasilisa couldn't identify. Without preamble, Vasilisa said, "You knew this would happen, didn't you? You could have told me." "Would you have listened?" Baba Yaga replied. Vasilisa thought about it, then shook her head. "I suppose not. They didn't deserve to die, and I'm glad I could help them. But I can't live with them anymore. They all think I'm a witch." "Well, of course they do. They may be stupid, but they're not that stupid. You are a witch." Vasilisa blinked. "What?" Yaga opened the gate and led a stunned Vasilisa into the yard. "You think that spell works for just anyone?" She patted Vasilisa's arm. Her hand felt warm and friendly. "I think you'll like being a witch. I'll teach you what I can, and when I'm gone, you'll have the hut and the chickens." Vasilisa stopped before stepping onto the ladder that led into the hut. "Tell me one thing, though. You don't have a nephew looking for a wife who can cook, do you?" Yaga glared at her. "Don't be ridiculous." "Good." Vasilisa relaxed. "I'll stay then." That is available in Did You Say Chicks, which was published by Baen Books. I'm sure the ebook is still available. I'm not sure if it's still in print. That hardcover was the Science Fiction Book Club edition, which I happen to have. And So you can check that out if you can track it down online. And the other Chicks and Chainmail anthologies are an absolute delight. Definitely worth your time. You can check me out online at DeCandido.net. My blog is at DeCandido.wordpress.com. And support me on Patreon if you could at patreon.com/KRAD. Thank you so much. And please stay safe.